Hi everyone. So today we are taking a look at lesson number 5 in the factoring unit, and we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations using factoring. Before we do that, we're going to learn something called the zero product law. It's a fancy name for something that we already know, that if we have two or more factors multiplying and their product is equal to 0, that means that one or more of those factors have to be 0. So if I say that I have these two factors multiplying and the result is 0, now this means that either this has to be a 0 or this has to be a 0 or both. Think about that. If I give you a bunch of examples, 5 times something equals a 0, well, it has to be a 0. Something multiplied 10 will be a 0. This has to be a 0. Negative 100 times something is equal to 0. This has to be a 0. So that one of those factors has to be a 0. And if both of those numbers are mystery numbers to us, then either of these numbers could be a 0. So if A and B multiply to equal to 0, then A could be a 0 or B could be a 0 or both. Okay? So that is what zero product law is. That if you have a product of factors and their product is 0, then one or both of the factors have to be 0. Now on top of that, how does that help us? Another background knowledge that we know is that if we are given something like this, we know how to solve it. If something equals to 0, we know we can add 3 to both sides here, and then x will be equal to 3. Or in this case, subtract 1 from both sides, and that means x can be equal to -1. So these are some background things that we have learned already that we're going to use now in this unit. So these are like those tools that are going to help us make sense about as to why do we need factoring. Okay, so what are some of the other things that we know? So we just learned about zero product law. That is something, a fancy name given to us, but we knew this already, that if two factors multiply, either of them could be 0. We know of something called, we already know about this. If I give you something like this, you know you can solve for x. This is called isolating the variable. Okay, so isolating variable is something we have been doing for a long time now. So we move things around, and then we can solve for x. So we've done much more complicated equations than this one. So these are all isolating variables. But the problem with isolating variables is it only works when the degree of my variable is 1. So you'll notice here x is just x. It doesn't quite work for equations, most of the equations where you have squares in them. So an example would be, we would run into a problem if I have something like this here. This is a situation where isolating variable is not going to work. Well, we could try if I move the 2 to the other side. But then what? Right? Now I'm left with this one. I could take the 3x to the other side, but that's not really going to help me because all I did was move it around to the other side. I can't solve it. So remember, solving means you should be able to have x equals something, some number. And in this scenario, no matter what I do in juggling it around, I won't be able to keep x on one side. In the past, students have suggested to me, when we're at this point, when I ask them, what can you do? They say, well, why don't you take an x out? Okay. But even then, now what two things multiply to become -2, it doesn't work. So we get stuck in solving with our past tools how to solve for x when we have what is called quadratic equations. So quadratic equations are equations where the degree of x is 2. Okay, so isolation works great till degree 1. Even if we have something simple like this, it works fine. We know how to deal with that. But when we get to more complicated quadratic equations, especially the trinomials, then isolating doesn't work. So this is where we're going to use something called zero product law. Plus, we're going to learn what we've been learning from the past course or so, which is factoring. These two things are going to become our tools that are going to help us solve equations which are quadratic equations, especially when they're in the form of a trinomial. And that's what this lesson is going to teach us. So don't forget, isolating still works as long as you have degree 1. So that is something you are going to keep using. We don't stop using it. We're just adding another tool to our belt, which is using factoring and zero product law in order to solve quadratic equations.